Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with part 2 of my March wrap-up. I will link part 1 of my March wrap-up down below, and the first book I'm going to talk about today is Healing Hearts by Sarah M. Eden. This is a historical romance, and it is known as a proper romance, which means there are no steamy scenes. And in this book we are following two main characters, Gideon and Miriam, and Gideon is a doctor in a small town in, I think it's Wyoming, like in the frontier era, and he is a doctor that is serving that town and like the surrounding area, and he decides that he's really overworked and he needs somebody to help him out, and he kind of decides that the best way to do this is to order a mail order bride who also has some background in nursing, so that like he can have a companion and also somebody to help him with his practice. And Miriam ends up answering the ad, but she shows up there and it turns out that there was some miscommunication through the employment agency, and Miriam does not know that she is showing up to marry him. She thinks it's just a regular job position. So they do not get married. The town is pretty upset at her because they all love Gideon and they want him to be happy, and they kind of see it as like Miriam jilting him, even though she did not agree to marry him. But she does end up staying in the town, and she does end up staying as his nurse, which obviously makes for some uncomfortable interactions and situations. So we follow this practice and we kind of see how important Gideon is to the town. We see him and Miriam slowly starting to get to know each other, and Miriam starts to help the town as well, and they kind of start to warm up to her. But while all this is going on, we know that there are some things in Miriam's past. There's actually a reason that she fled where she was before this, and we are learning more and more about what that is throughout the book, and those things kind of start catching up to Miriam, and so she's afraid that she won't be able to keep these secrets from the people in the town, Savage Wells, and she's also afraid that she won't be able to stay here where she finally feels a little bit safe and a little bit happy. And this book was kind of a mixed experience. I was a little disappointed in it, and I did really enjoy a different book I read by this author, which was like a different series and setting and everything, but I really enjoyed that one, and so I went into this one thinking I would like it more than I did. I thought the setting and the doctor plot element was really interesting, like just seeing, like it wasn't graphic or anything, but just seeing how doctors in this time period had to practice, and kind of like seeing the development of some techniques that we know very well today. I also liked some of the side characters, and I also appreciated some of the topics that this book dealt with, like the ones connected with Miriam's backstory become a pretty prominent part of the story, and I appreciated that this book handled those or like dealt with those in this historical context. And I also liked some things about the ending. That's actually what bumped this book up a little for me, because this was feeling pretty middle of the road for me, but I ended up bumping it from 3 stars to 3.5 stars because, again, I just really liked some things about the ending. But like overall this feels more like a 3 star, so I don't know. And then as for the things that I didn't like, sadly one of the big things that didn't do a lot for me was Gideon and Miriam's romance. I just didn't really feel the connection between them or the spark, and again I have read a different book by this author that I did really enjoy, and I liked the romance a lot in that one, so that was disappointing here. I also was like pretty frustrated with Gideon because I feel like the townspeople judging Miriam for not marrying the doctor, like for not marrying Gideon, I feel like that was pretty much shown as like they're being unreasonable and like they just need to get to know her and everything. But Gideon, like he kept being all like sad and hurt because she didn't want to marry him, and like we find out that he has some like, you know, some less than great past history with women, so like I understand that he might take this harder than maybe somebody else would, but the way he was acting is like, oh man, now somebody else rejected me, and it's like she didn't know she was marrying you, like she never said she was going to marry you. I feel like even in this time period it was pretty unreasonable to feel like that was a personal affront when it's like, okay, but the other person did not actually agree to marry you, so like they're not dumping you, you were just never going to be together to begin with. So that frustrated me. And then also I had some issues with the writing at the beginning. It's funny because in the other book I've read by Sarah M. Eden, I mentioned how like some of the historical elements were like kind of over explained at the beginning of that book, and then that got a lot better as the story went on. With this book I feel like character motivations and like character things were over explained at the beginning, and that was especially frustrating because we don't know all of the information for a while, so we just kept getting these repetitive, vague allusions to what Miriam was running from. And even if you kind of figure out some of what's going on, it's still frustrating to have like these repeated references to something. And like on Gideon's side, it was kind of similar. It was like just over and over. It's like, yes, we know that you're a doctor. We know that you're sad that Miriam wouldn't marry you. We know this is uncomfortable. Like it just, I don't know. It felt like those things were like really emphasized over and over way more than we needed. And that did get a lot better as the book went on. I feel like that just kind of stopped being an issue, but for the first chunk of this book, I found that pretty annoying. And then I also had mixed feelings about the major conflict of this book, because that is related to Miriam's past. And like, on the one hand, I do, like I said earlier, I do appreciate that this book was dealing with some of those topics, but I feel like it kind of took over the story in a way I wasn't necessarily expecting. So I'm kind of all over the place with this one. I am excited to read more from this author, but this was not a huge hit for me. And I gave Healing Hearts 3.5 stars. Next, I finished Excellent Women by Barbara Pym, and this is actually a reread for me. So I first read this book like a couple years ago, and I listened to it, was it already a couple years ago? Oh my gosh. I listened to it on audio, and I said even at the time that even though I really enjoyed it, I have a feeling I would love it even more if I read it physically, because even though the narrator did a really good job, I happened to be listening to this book during a weekend that was just really exhausting and busy, and I was doing lots of like packing and unpacking and loading, like moving boxes and things. So when I would be listening to this book, like when I was taking a break, I was super tired and I kept like falling asleep listening to it because the narrator had a very soothing voice, which was again not the fault of the book or the narrator. So I definitely didn't feel like I was catching or remembering all the nuances of the book. And I finally got around to rereading it, and I was correct. I enjoyed it even more this time. I really, really loved this book. So Barbara Pym is a kind of underhyped classic author. She was writing in, I think, the 50s and 60s, and she tended to write kind of like quiet English village stories that are like kind of deceptive social commentary. Like you read them and they're really funny and they're these great like quirky characters, and then in addition to that, they deal with some, I think, really thoughtful messages. Like the message of this book, I think, is like, it's called Excellent Women, and like kind of one of the main motifs of this novel is like this idea of excellent women, like women who are, you know, kind of ordinary, and they're not like extremely beautiful or like extremely successful or extremely famous. Like they don't have super dramatic lives, but basically how a lot of the world runs on these excellent women, just like doing their best and doing their job and taking care of people and doing all these little things that kind of keep society functioning. And I feel like one of the kind of central questions of this novel is, are lives that are kind of small and ordinary and they have kind of little moments, like little joys and little sorrows, like are those lives still important and still beautiful? And I think this novel's answer is a resounding yes, which is one of the things that I really loved about it. And I realize I have not even given you a synopsis. So we follow our main character Mildred, and she is, I think she's like maybe in her 30s or 40s. And I think she actually lives near London, but like her community kind of feels more like a village. So even though it's not in a small town, it kind of has that small town feel. And we follow her and her friendships and her entanglements with other characters, and kind of like this small, like these kind of like small society dramas that like every community has. Basically, Mildred ends up getting much more involved in the lives of her neighbors than she plans to. We see her interactions with other characters, we see her start to meet new people, and this is just such a lovely book. Like, the writing is wonderful, the humor is so clever, and just like I actually laughed out loud or like snorted a couple times while reading this book, which does not happen often when I read. I just found this like very funny, and something that I also like about the humor and the book overall is it's like this very warm and compassionate humor. Like even when Barbara Pym is like kind of making fun of these characters or inviting you to laugh at them, there's always this undercurrent of like compassion for them, which I really appreciated. Like even the somewhat silly or ridiculous ones, like you still get the feeling that they're people, and that Barbara Pym is still like aware of their humanity, which I really like. And I loved Mildred as a character. She is very relatable in a lot of ways. Also, some of the main plot focuses of this book were really interesting, like the like high Anglican drama going on like with her church groups was really interesting, and like she ends up falling in with a group of archaeologists, and that was really interesting. I was also pleasantly surprised by this book being like kind of relatively ahead of its time. Like it's definitely not like the most progressive thing ever, and like there are, especially since a lot of the characters are archaeologists, there are some ways of talking about other cultures that like we probably would not use those words today. But overall, I think there were more places than I expected where the way the book was written or the way Mildred reacted or other characters reacted would kind of like, even if like an attitude of the time was like shown in this book, other characters would kind of comment on it or think about it in a way that made it clear that that wasn't okay, which I like appreciated. Again, like don't go in expecting like incredibly progressive or anything, but I think considering when it was written and considering what the story is, I was pleasantly surprised by that. This is also just a really cozy and warm book. And yeah, I just loved it. I'm so excited to read more Barbara Pym. My edition also has an introduction by A.N. Wilson, and I liked some of that. I think it was interesting and it provided some interesting ideas or context, but one thing I disagree with is the author the author of the introduction really emphasized the feeling of melancholy in this book, and that definitely is present. Like, there are definitely some scenes that are very bittersweet, and like there's moments of like, oh, do I want to laugh or do I want to cry? And I get that, but I think overall the tone of this book is more fulfilling and light than that, which kind of goes back to what I was saying about, like, I think one of the central questions is, are ordinary lives still beautiful and still exciting? And I think the answer is yes, and I think that this book's answer is yes. So I didn't really love that the author of the introduction kind of downplayed that. From what I've heard, a few of Barbara Pym's other novels are much more melancholy, but this one I don't think is so much. So that was my personal response to the introduction, but overall I absolutely loved this novel. I gave Excellent Women 5 stars this time around, and like I said, I'm just so excited to read more from Barbara Pym. Next, I have a nonfiction book, and you're going to be seeing quite a few nonfiction books in this wrap-up, and that is the Artemisia Files, Artemisia Gentileschi for Feminists and Other Thinking People, edited by Mike Ball. And this was a present from my lovely friend Yvette from Book Cave, so thank you so much. I was very excited to add to my Artemisia collection, and I really enjoyed this. This is a collection of 6 essays, and each of the writers addresses a different topic or a different position on the scholarship of Artemisia and her work, and specifically related to how, like, kind of the intersection of Artemisia's work and story with feminist thinking and with more general, like, art critique and everything. I also liked, while I was reading this book, that I could look up the paintings they were talking about, because even though they have a lot of the images of the paintings reproduced, seeing them in color I think really does make a difference, and it can kind of like, it can help you better see, I think, what the writers are talking about sometimes. So I really liked doing that. One thing I want to note is this book was published, let's see, this book was published in 2005, so like 16 years ago now, wow. And so it's not the most intersectional collection. Like, there are 6 contributors, and as far as I know, they are all white women. So do keep that in mind if you're going to pick this one up. But I did really like almost all of the essays. It was interesting because the introduction, which is written by Mike Ball, who edited this collection, the introduction, like, the way, I don't know if this was like the way that she described some of the essays, or if just some of the essays ended up winning me over when I didn't expect them to, but there were a couple that she like briefly summarized where I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna be on board for this, but then I ended up really enjoying the essay, so that was interesting. And because there are only 6 essays, I'm just gonna go briefly through each one because I did take a couple notes. So just very briefly, the first essay is Artemisia's Hand by Mary D. Garrard, and I really loved that one. I think that was one of my favorites in the collection, and this was about attribution and looking at the way that Artemisia painted women's hands, and how, like, not just what that symbolizes, but how that can actually help art historians attribute certain paintings to her or to other artists, like basically determine if these are probably Artemisia's or if they're probably somebody else's. And I found it very convincing. There's a couple paintings that are still not officially, I think, agreed upon as being Artemisia's, and based on like Mary Garrett's analysis and the other examples she uses, I would agree with her. I don't think Artemisia did paint them because just like the way that she did the hands of these women is completely different. It has no similarity to anything else in her body of work. So I just really enjoyed that essay, and I really like too that she didn't just do it, like Mary Garrett didn't just write about it on a surface level of like strong hands equals strong women. And then the second is Judging Artemisia, a Baroque Woman in Modern Art History by Nanette Salomon. And this one I really liked as well. This one, she was looking at specifically the 3 Susanna paintings that Artemisia did and kind of analyzing those and talking about those. The third essay is Gran Macchina e Bellezza, looking at the Gentileschi Judiths by Elena Ciletti. And this one I thought was really interesting as well. I think the concept is so interesting. So Gran Macchina e Bellezza, like the translation plus the connotation, essentially adds up to beauty, but with the subtext of a war machine. Like beauty that is used as a weapon of war, which I just thought was a fascinating idea, and I really enjoyed seeing the way that Elena Ciletti explored that, and just like really like looking at some of the artistic choices Artemisia made and like analyzing those and just like how effective they were. And yeah, I just like really enjoyed that one as well. Number 4 is Death, Dispassion, and the Female Hero, Artemisia Gentileschi's Yael and Sisera by Babette Bone. So this was an analysis of a specific painting of Artemisia's that doesn't get a lot of scholarly attention, and this was actually very gratifying to read because I have always thought that this painting should get more attention because of how it fits into some of her other work. The fifth essay was Grounds of Comparison by Mike Bell, and this one was one of the more, I think, esoteric essays to me, like just because like I know a little bit about art history from reading books like this, but I'm definitely not trained in art history, and I think this essay would have been easier to follow if I had more of a background in that. So this was a little more confusing than the others, but once I figured out what Ball was getting at, I did really enjoy it. Like I ultimately really liked the message, which is about the way that the traditional approach of art critique relies on comparison, and how when you do that, somebody always has to be an inferior artist. Like that's always how you end up framing it, is one artist is better than the other, and just like the way that that's very limiting. So I really enjoyed that, especially as that relates to how Artemisia's work has been undermined for so long and underappreciated. And then finally, the last essay was Feminist Dilemmas with the Art Life Problem by Griselda Pollock. And this was actually the only essay in the whole collection that I wasn't really on board with. So the things, it's weird because there were a couple ideas that I did actually like. One of the things she talks about is a historical movie that was somewhat based on Artemisia's life, which I have not seen and I will never see because they turn Artemisia's rape into a love story. So I have no interest in watching that ever. I do like that Griselda Pollock was critiquing that movie and looking at the ways that it did not really accomplish what we imagine the director was trying to do. I do wish that Pollock had been a little bit more, I don't know, a little firmer about like the things that movie did wrong, because I personally find that a pretty unforgivable thing to change in a movie, and I just wish that she had been more clear about that. But one big problem I had with this essay is like kind of a throwaway comment that she makes, where she, like, I don't even think this is the main point of her essay. She doesn't give any examples to back it up. She doesn't really address, like, further pursue this line of thought at all. And that is that in this author's opinion, Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of Judith slaying Holofernes, or Judith beheading Holofernes, has absolutely nothing to do with Artemisia's own life and experiences. And I just have an issue with that. I find that hard to believe, and I understand the danger. Like, one of the things that she's talking about and that this essay collection in general is kind of addressing is the danger of using critique methods, including feminist art theory, to kind of like bury a historical figure under your own interpretations. And I understand that, but I don't think that that means you should just say Artemisia's life was always separate from her paintings, because I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't know how you would even go about proving that. Like, yes, it was a common subject for Renaissance painters to paint, but the choices that Artemisia made specifically, and if you look at her paintings, like, to compare them, even though you're not, comparison is not a great method to use, but if you were to compare them to other similar paintings of that subject, like, I feel like the choices she made are still worth examining in the context of her life. Like, I'm not saying that all of her work depends on her life experiences. I'm not saying that we should reduce her work to a response to her sexual assault when she was young, but I think that it is something to consider when you're talking about her and her work, and I just find it very odd that Griselda Pollock did not, that she's against that she doesn't think that Artemisia's life had anything to do with those paintings. And although I liked the fact that Pollock moved away from some scholars' suggestion that because Artemisia was living in the time period and context that she did not experience rape as a traumatic experience that a modern person would, and that it was like basically framing it as like, well, historically it was an issue of like she went to court because her father's property had been damaged, which was Artemisia's virginity. And there are actually some scholars who believe that her sexual assault and trial should be viewed through that lens, rather than even taking into consideration the traumatic experience that Artemisia had undergone, like basically saying that people did not understand that it was traumatic then. So I like that Pollock seemed to be saying that was not a good way to view it, but some other ways that she discussed the trial transcript just bothered me. So yeah, that particular essay I was not the biggest fan of. Again, that was really the only one in the collection where I like disagreed with it or had some major issues with it. So overall, I did really enjoy this collection. I gave the Artemisia Files 4.5 stars, and I would definitely recommend it if you have any interest in Artemisia Gentileschi or her work, or feminist art theory, like art theory in general. Next, I finished The Unwelcome Guest by R.J. Anderson, and this is a very short story set after the events of her novel Knife. If you signed up for her author newsletter, you got to read the story, and I really enjoyed it. And we follow Paul, one of the main characters from that novel, and a friend that he made during the first book, and essentially having to explain that to his parents. I'm being very vague because of spoilers, but yeah, I really enjoyed this short story. I loved seeing the characters from Knife again. I feel a lot of sympathy for Paul's parents, especially like his mother could be kind of frustrating in the way she was responding to things, because of course, like, I have read the novel, and people reading the story have probably read the novel, so like we know what's really going on here. But the way things appear, I'm like, I don't really blame his mom for being suspicious, and I feel kind of bad for her. It's like, this story is such a well-written example of the things that like YA parents probably went through or would have to go through after the events of the books are over. So yeah, I really liked this. I love the writing, love the characters, and I was really excited to get some see a little bit of what happened after Knife, and I gave this story 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Charlotte by Helen Moffat. It's like a story set after the events of Pride and Prejudice that follows Charlotte Lucas as our main character. And this is actually the second Charlotte-centered Jane Austen novel that I have read. The first one was The Clergyman's Wife by Molly Greeley, which I really loved. It's one of those books that, like, the longer I think about it, the more I'm like, maybe that should have been on my favorite books of the year list the year I read it. But anyway, so this one also follows Charlotte, and in some ways it has, I think, similar themes, but I think they're both definitely worth reading. And so this novel, we follow Charlotte after the events of Pride and Prejudice, as I said, and after the choices that she makes. So in this novel, she is married, and we follow her through a part of her life. We see what her life is like after the choices that she did make in Pride and Prejudice. We see her family, I'm trying to think of things I can say without spoiling this book or Pride and Prejudice in case you haven't read it yet. Basically, this is a novel about grief, and about love in many different forms. It's about healing. It's about opportunities. For part of this novel, Charlotte gets to go and stay with a friend of hers, and we really see the way that lets Charlotte reflect on her life and some of her choices. And yeah, I don't know what to say about the plot of this one too much, but I did overall really enjoy it. I really liked the writing, and I thought Charlotte was written as a very compelling and sympathetic character. I think a testament to that and to the skill of the writing is that at the very beginning of this novel, something very serious, very heavy and upsetting happens, and even though the book had just started and we hadn't really had a chance to get to know Charlotte super well, I still really felt for Charlotte. I think the emotional impact of that moment was still really there, even though, again, we hadn't spent a lot of time getting to know Charlotte yet. I thought the characters were really well developed. I thought the plot was interesting. This is definitely more of a character-focused story, but I did like the directions that the story took for the most part, and even though the pace of the story is somewhat slow, it never felt boring because I think the characters were so complex, and I was so invested in seeing what Charlotte would do and how she would get to know these other characters. I really enjoyed getting to revisit some characters from Pride and Prejudice. I thought they were characterized very well. I really enjoyed getting to know a couple of original characters. There's one in particular who I really liked his character. I thought this book handled some topics very thoughtfully, especially grief. As I said, grief is a huge theme of this novel, a huge element, and seeing Charlotte deal with that, I thought was very touching and very well written. Also, Anne de Berg's character in this novel, it was very interesting to follow her and to see the direction that the author took her story in. Overall, I liked it. Something that was also interesting about the structure of this book is that because Charlotte meets a new character, she is kind of able to reflect on earlier parts of her life, so we kind of get flashback chapters, which I'm normally not a fan of, but I thought they were done really well. And I also, I saw some reviewers had an issue with the format of those. They were like, Charlotte would never have been this honest with the person she didn't know that well, but I think that the way they're structured, I think we're not supposed to view those chapters as a word for word what Charlotte said to this person. I took it more as for the benefit of the reader, it's written like a novel, and a novel where we know exactly what's happening, what Charlotte's feeling. Really, the only things I didn't like about this book are a couple of directions the story went. There were a couple of story or character things that I didn't really enjoy. I either didn't enjoy that they happened or didn't enjoy the way they were done. And also, I was not a big fan of the epilogue. There's some things I liked about it, but some things that I felt very dissatisfied with. And basically, if the author convinces us that two characters have a lasting connection between them, I'm going to expect some follow through on that. So that was kind of like one of my big issues. But overall, I thought this was really well done, and I gave Charlotte 4 stars. Next, I finished The Widows of Malabar Hill by Sujata Masi. This is a historical mystery novel. It takes place in 1920s Bombay, and we follow our main character, Praveen Mistry, who's actually inspired by a real woman, a real person in India who was, I think she was the first female lawyer in India, or one of the first. And so Praveen Mistry, she is working for her father's law firm, and she's looking over the paperwork for one of their clients when she notices that this man who has died, he leaves behind 3 widows, and Praveen notices that all 3 widows have signed away all of their inheritance, which leaves them nothing to live on. And Praveen starts getting a little suspicious. She starts wondering if somebody is like pressuring these women or tricking them, or like what's going on, and she decides to investigate that. So we follow Praveen as she's trying to figure out what's going on, and then somebody actually gets murdered, so this turns into a murder mystery. And we also learn a lot more about Praveen's past and some tragic things that happened in her past. And I really liked this. I thought this was a very compelling story. I liked Praveen as a main character. I also thought it was really interesting that Praveen and her family are Parsis, which means that they are Zoroastrians who live in India. And I think I've only ever read one other book that had a Zoroastrian main character, so that was really interesting, and I really liked seeing those elements in the book. I thought the mystery elements were interesting. I don't think it was necessarily supposed to be like the most shocking twists throughout the book, which actually I appreciated. I kind of liked the slow like revealing of like character motivations and backstory and all of that. And I also like the flashback sections. As I've mentioned recently in this video, I don't tend to be a fan of flashbacks, but they can be done well. And this was another book that I think they were done very well in. I think they provided some really necessary backstory on Praveen, and I also think that the issues they handled were really important ones. Those chapters could be hard to read at times just because of what was going on, but I liked that the book tackled those things. I also liked the setting, and I also liked that this book makes the distinction between traditional practices that are harmful and ones that are not. Like there's some discussion of traditional Parsi practices, and some of those can be very harmful and have fallen out of favor. And Praveen makes the point that not all traditional practices are bad, but the ones that are, like, you can let go of, and that doesn't mean that you are less part of a culture or religion. And I really liked that, and just like the general emphasis on the fact that groups are not monoliths. And also related to that, the 3 widows that the mystery is surrounding, they live in Purda, so they live separated from the men of their household. Praveen herself is not Muslim, so there's not a huge emphasis on Islam in this book, but I would be curious to know how Muslim readers feel about the way that Islam was portrayed in this book, and I gave The Widows of Malabar Hill 4 stars. Next, I finished Lucrezia Borja by Sarah Bradford, and this is a nonfiction book about Lucrezia Borja, and this is the nonfiction pick for Read the Renaissance Book Club, which I was reading along with. Again, I will link that live show down below. I talked about the historical fiction pick in my previous wrap-up, and this is the nonfiction one, and okay, I liked this more than the other book, than the historical fiction one, but I had some major issues with it, which I'm really disappointed by, because at the beginning I was really, really enjoying this. I found it really interesting. I thought it was well written. I liked the focus of the book, and then I just ended up really not liking it. So do take this review with a grain of salt, because I want to mention, like I did before, that I am not very knowledgeable about the Borgias, like about their family or like anything surrounding them. So maybe if I had a little more background knowledge, I would have gotten more out of this. I don't know. But my feelings on this book going into it, again, looking to learn more about Lucrezia and not having a ton of knowledge about like her family or the surrounding like history, I did not think this was very well done. I did like a couple things about it. I liked the beginning, and I do think that some of the chapters of this book were a lot more interesting than others. So there were things that I enjoyed throughout the book, or there were chapters that I enjoyed throughout, but I had so many problems with the way this book was written and structured. It was so confusing. Like, it was incredibly hard to follow, and it was also, I think, just not always written very well. And I also had some major issues with the way this book was structured, and I question some of the like decisions that the publisher or the editor made, because Sarah Bradford, like, multiple times per chapter would just launch into this page-long or like several paragraphs long list of like whatever. So she would just go on and on about, like, she would tell you that Lucrezia was part of a procession, and rather than giving you just a general idea of who was in the procession, she would list in excruciating detail like how many donkeys there were, how many litters were carried, how many serving girls she had with her, how many like secondary serving girls she had with her, just on and on and on. and it was really, really boring to read those parts. And sometimes, like, it's not like you could just skim them. Like, I don't tend to skim anyway, but even if you wanted to, I'm not sure you could, because sometimes she would be listing people who would be really important later on, so like you needed to know who they were. And I think that if we were gonna keep those long sections, they should have been set off from the text, maybe in like boxes or something, just to break up the flow of the paragraph, because otherwise it was so long and boring and hard to read and just confusing. And then speaking of lists, so I think Sarah Bradford, I think she might be an English writer, and I know that there are different conventions with using commas and like semicolons in American versus British English, but she changed the way she used them throughout the book. Like the way, like she would not make it clear when she was listing people and descriptions, which description went with which person. And again, a lot of times she was listing people who would come up later. So it's like, well, I need to know if this person is like so-and-so's husband or the ambassador or like the prince of another kingdom. Like that's really important to know, and it was completely unclear from the way this was written. I also think she included way too many quotes and just like really long quotes. Also, this is more of like a pet peeve, but it does kind of bug me that multiple times throughout this book she quoted Machiavelli, like from The Prince, when she was talking about Cesare Borgia, because there was also way too much Cesare in this book. I don't understand the like interest in him, but she would like quote these long passages from The Prince without ever mentioning that there's a strong possibility that The Prince was intended as a satire, which like really changes the tone of those quotes. Like, I know that that's not universally agreed upon, but from my understanding, it's a theory that is plausible enough that I think it should have been mentioned when she was quoting it so extensively, because again, that changes the tone of the quotes. It changes the context of like what she was writing about. Like she was quoting him praising Cesare Borgia, and I'm like, well, okay, if this is a satire though, that probably is not what he means. So again, that's more of a minor complaint, but that was something that bugged me. And then also, unlike the very beginning of the book where I felt like I had a pretty good handle on who was who and what was going on, I feel like as the book went on, the actual historical facts got harder to follow. Like I mentioned in the historical fiction book that it was really sometimes hard to tell like just like what was going on or why things were happening, and that happened here too, and I think that was partly a function of just how confusing the writing was. And it's like, if you're reading a historical nonfiction, I feel like the bare minimum is that you should understand like historically what was happening, and a lot of times I did not. So maybe this is a great nonfiction book if you already have like some grounding in this family and like the political climate surrounding them, but I did not, and I found this very frustrating to read, and frankly it was also just really, really boring a lot of times. Once again, Cesare got way too much page time. Don't know why he was in here so much. This is supposed to be about Lucrezia. And then also I feel like Sarah Bradford kind of did some of the things that really annoyed me about the other book, Blood and Beauty, because it seems like she wants to sort of play against these stereotypes about the Borgias, about like what a disgusting and like taboo family they were, like these horrible things they did. But then sometimes the way she was writing about them, it was kind of like playing into that, even in some contexts where like the historical record does not support the idea that they did those things. Like I've been reading a lot more about the Borgias recently, obviously, and it's like pretty much agreed upon that there is no historical evidence that there was any incest involved, which is one of the things that the Borgias are infamous for. And there's like no evidence to suggest it. And in fact, the person who made this claim was Lucrezia's first husband, whose marriage was annulled against his will and on grounds of his impotence. So he like probably is not the most neutral party about Lucrezia's like sexual or romantic history. So yeah, like that just really bugged me as well. Like yeah, there were some parts that I found interesting, and like I will say that something I found really funny is that like in historical fiction book, the author Sarah Dunnett is like, Juan Borgia was the worst and nobody liked him except his dad. And then in this book, Sarah Bradford is like, historically, Juan Borgia was the worst and no one liked him except his dad. Like I thought that was really funny that like basically everyone agreed that Juan sucked. So yeah, like there were some moments like that that I thought were interesting or entertaining, but overall, I was really disappointed. I gave this 2.75 stars. I couldn't give it 3 stars because like I really don't think it accomplished what it was trying to do very well. Like I left this book very confused and frustrated and bored, and I feel like that's not what it was trying to do. Next, I finished Letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and this was our Past It Classics pick for March. I will link that live show down below, and Taylor was the host for that one, and Taylor and Julie and I like really enjoyed discussing this one. We had a really great conversation, and thank you to everybody, by the way, who has been joining us and like sharing your thoughts. We have really enjoyed that. Yeah, this is a nonfiction piece. It was a letter that obviously Dr. King wrote from Birmingham Jail, and it has become a classic of nonfiction, and I think for a very good reason. I had read some excerpts from it in high school. We read it when we were talking about persuasive techniques and like rhetoric and everything. And I'm so glad I finally got the chance to read the whole thing. I thought this was brilliant. I think the writing is very clear while also being very beautiful. Like there are some like really beautiful lines, but like they're also very like to the point. I think the writing balances beauty and clarity really well. Dr. King draws on a lot of different examples and sources and like techniques and ideas. I also think this letter is really interesting because even though a lot of it is on the importance of peace and nonviolent direct action, there's also quite a few passages that are about justice and how you cannot have peace without justice. Like it's not a true peace if there is not justice, and I feel like those parts of Dr. King do not get quoted nearly as often. We also talk a lot in that live show about how a lot of these things he's talking about still very much apply to the US today. And yeah, I thought that this was brilliant. I gave it 5 stars. I don't really know how you could give it anything else. I just think this is just an incredible piece of writing. Like it is obviously really important in history, but also as a piece by itself, it is just so well written and thoughtful and powerful. And the fact that he wrote this in the margins of a newspaper and like with no editing, just like, you know, off the cuff is just pretty incredible. And I am just going to leave you with one of the quotes that we talked about. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. And finally, the last book I finished in March, and this was actually another one that like was technically after midnight, so this was officially my first book in April, but I'm counting it for March, and that is Twisted: The Tangled History of Black Hair Culture by Emma Dabiri. And Emma Dabiri is Irish and Nigerian. This is a nonfiction book about black hair and the history and context surrounding black hair, both in Africa pre-colonization and also in the African diaspora. And it also, like, another big point of this book is like it talks about the importance of hair and how it's not just hair. And how it represents so much more than that. And I thought this was just really fantastic. I loved the writing. I think Emma Dabiri writes very clearly. She has some great humor as well, but she also is really great at like letting the emotional parts land. You know, she talks about slavery, she talks about colonization, she talks about racism, micro and macro aggressions, and yeah, so there's a lot of like very heavy content in here. And I think Emma Dabiri did a really good job of addressing those emotional moments, while also including some humor, like a little bit of humor throughout the book, and also just being a very compelling and easy to read book, and of course also very informative. I really love the sections focusing on the cultural history of hair and just like the history of African groups in general, and like how much rich history they have that like in Western society we don't, like, well, specifically white Western society, we just don't talk about. We deliberately don't talk about. I thought the way that she makes connections between topics was just really fantastic. And again, that kind of goes back to this point of like, it's just hair, and she shows that it's not. I think she shows very clearly that it's not just hair. I think she also does a great job of addressing the complexities of certain issues. Like, so for example, when she's talking about Madam C.J. Walker as being one of the first, if not the first, self-made African-American millionaire, and she talks about how that's kind of a positive and negative because the way that she made her money was kind of playing into some of these ideas about fixing bad African-American hair and making it good hair, which is, you know, looking more like white people's hair. So she talks about like how she can be an inspiration while also having this other context at play. And I think she just handled those complexities really, really well. And as I was saying earlier, I think she also does a great job at communicating the cost and the toll when she's talking about the legacies of slavery and colonization and racism. Through her writing, she does such an excellent job of conveying that loss, that sense of loss and of like what could have been. Like when she's talking about the brilliant mathematicians from Africa and how like all of this knowledge that we could have had if not for slavery and colonization. So like she talks about the human toll, obviously, but also the toll that these have taken on imagination and on ideas and on discovery. She also weaves in some topics and again like makes connections between them in really interesting ways, like this idea of laziness, and she talks about like the ways that that has been associated with Black people, and also just like the concept of laziness and like of wasting time or something taking too much time as like a very Western idea, and I found that part so interesting. So yeah, I just thought this was really brilliant. There were one or two places that I don't know if I quite saw the connection she was making, like at one point she talks about the like invention of the oil painting and how that kind of started the process of objectification of women's bodies. Like if she meant like the rise of painting or portraits in general, I think I could follow that. But I was surprised that she like specifically mentioned the oil painting as being the start of that. So that was interesting. So like again, there was like one or two places like that where I don't know if I quite like followed what she was like the connection that she was drawing there, but overall I thought this was just so fantastic, so well written and researched. And shout out to Aoife from Words of Clover, because I think her channel was the first place I heard from this. I know Ashley at Bookish Realm has done a whole video on this book. I will link that as well. And I gave Twisted 5 stars. Okay everybody, so those are the rest of the books that I read in March. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. And also let me know a nonfiction book that you have read and really enjoyed recently. I had a lot of great nonfiction in this month. Sadly, one of them was not a hit, but overall, really great month for nonfiction for me. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!